how we view God impacts how we interact with God. And in this new series, we're going to unpack biblical images of God used in the Hebrew Scriptures, and then how Jesus picks up on these very same images to not only affirm His unique relationship to God the Father, but to also help people to understand what He is like as well. So may you be encouraged and inspired as you experience God in a deeper way. A.W. Tozer once said that what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important part about us. And the reason why he said that is that he knew that how we think about God will dictate how we relate to God. So we want to think well on God so that our relationship continues to grow. Now, if you were to ask somebody from a Western world context the question, what is God like? You will typically get answers like, well, God is good. God is love, God is holy, God is merciful, God is kind, and all of that is accurate. But if you ask someone from a more Middle Eastern context, what is God like? You will get answers in the form of, well, God is like a rock or a fortress, or like a shepherd, a farmer, a benevolent monarch. It's much more picture-driven with rooted, concrete images of things that you can see and feel and touch. Now, that doesn't mean that Western answers are wrong. These are accurate, they're theological, they're biblical. But when it comes to a more Eastern set of answers, they're just more concrete. You can get your arms around them. You can see the picture that they're communicating. And so one of the things that we find is that all throughout the Bible, we have these images of God, these biblical images of God. And in this series, we are going to explore a number of them with the desired hope that our understanding of what God is like will increase so that our relationship will also go deeper with God. Now, here's what's really cool about this particular series is that all of these biblical images we're going to look at that pertain to God in the Hebrew Scriptures, Jesus picks up on in the New Testament. Now, we're going to begin with this series, this phrase, living water. And for that, we've got to go to Jeremiah chapter 2. Now, Jeremiah is a prophet to the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom has already been taken out by Assyria. Everything has gone sideways in the southern kingdom. And through the prophet Jeremiah, God speaks and he says this, "For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water." So God says that I am the fountain of living waters. Now, the word living waters in Hebrew is this phrase, maim chaim. And it means living waters, but these are waters directly from God, like in the form of rain, or waters that are moving, like you're going to find in a sea or a lake, a river, or a spring. And the best way to think about this is moving waters versus stagnant waters. Stagnant is not good. Moving waters is living waters. That is good water. Now, God says that I am the fountain of living waters, and the contrast is hewed out cisterns. Now, everyone in the ancient world understood how a cistern worked. Let me take you to an ancient site and show you a really old cistern that we find in the early Bronze Age portion of a city called Arad, which is about 38 miles away from Jerusalem. Now, here is this circular structure. That is the cistern. You come to the railing and you look down and you see this. This is not a well. A well is something that you tap to the water table for. This is a cistern, which is a container that holds water. And the water that is in here is stagnant. So you can already see this moving versus stagnant reality in the contrast between cisterns and living waters. But to give you a better image of what living waters looks like, you have to understand the context for the prophet Jeremiah, because geography and where these prophets come from all factor into the things that they are recording, even if they're recording it on behalf of God. And when it comes to Jeremiah, we find that in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is from the city of Anatot. And Anatot is 2 miles to the northeast of Jerusalem, and it sits within the Judean wilderness, this vast wilderness of just a lot of brown. And so this is where Anatot is on the edge of this, and anyone who is hearing the phrase living waters on the lips of a prophet who is from the Judean wilderness will immediately think of the famous oasis of En-Gedi. And for those of you who have been to Israel before, you have probably set foot in this treasured site. But this is the area of En-Gedi. It's got a couple of different wadis here. And when you start trekking back into the Judean wilderness through En-Gedi, you immediately see the greenery and the water and the oasis nature that En-Gedi is. It's also a place where you'll often come across the Nubian ibex with the killer goatees. These are desert animals, and when they're looking for fresh water, they go to En-Gedi because En-Gedi is an oasis in the middle of the desert. And as you go back, you hit these waterfalls until you come to the third waterfall at the very back, and you have the enormous perennial waterfall shooting out of the top of the desert down into a pool of water. And it is just beautiful and serene. And this is your picture of living waters. And God says, "For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cistern for themselves." But notice this, broken cisterns that can hold no water. So it's like they have forsaken God, who is like En-Gedi, and instead they have chosen a cistern, and yet not just a cistern, one that doesn't even hold water. It is broken, it is messed up. And God goes, "I'm this, you're choosing that. Like, what in the world are you thinking?" And when you hold up these two images side by side, you go, why would anyone choose that? And yet God says, this is what my people have done. They have forsaken me, the source of living waters, and instead they decided to go after a cistern, and what's more, a broken cistern. I think this is such a beautiful word picture because it not only pulls us into what God is like in just a very tangible image, but it also speaks to the reality that so often in our own lives, we actually do the same thing. That this is what God is offering, and yet in the midst of the deserts, these hard times in life, we often go after things that don't ultimately satisfy. That God says, this is your greatest need, this is your greatest longing, come to me, and yet we choose things that aren't what God would want, and they're things that we think are going to be helpful to us, but often become a source of continued frustration and heartache because we choose things that don't nourish our soul. They actually, in a way, kind of crack at our soul even more. And so we've got this big, beautiful image of what God is like as living waters. Now, I want you to hold on to this because we're going to cycle back to this at the end of the teaching, and I want to jump forward now to Jesus in the New Testament. And particularly, I want to take you to John 7, verses 1 and 2, where it says this, "After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand." Now, the reference to the Feast of Booths here is to the Jewish festival of Sukkot. And this is translated into our English as either the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Ingathering. And I'll get to the ingathering in just a moment. But Sukkot means tabernacles or tents or booths, all around a temporary dwelling. And these are the main passages connected to Sukkot in the Hebrew scriptures, as well as a reference into the Mishnah. And you can look these up on your own time. But Sukkot was one of the three main pilgrim festivals alongside of Passover and the Feast of Weeks, which is Pentecost in Acts 2, where the Jewish people would stream up to Jerusalem to celebrate. And Sukkot was a week-long festival, and they would celebrate this by living in temporary shelters called a sukkah, which is where you get the plural Sukkot, a tent or a tabernacle. And this festival, much like the rest of the Jewish festivals, were recounting God's provision about something that happened in the past. And this is the 40 years of Israel's vulnerable experience in the desert, where they lived in tents or temporary shelters called a sukkah. And so it's in reference to a past event, but it's also in connection to a present reality in connection to the agricultural calendar. And this was a fall festival where you would be bringing in all of the remaining crops, and it became a Thanksgiving festival. Fun fact here, you have the Puritans developed the festival of Thanksgiving around how the Jewish people celebrated Sukkot. But there was also a future plea or element to the festival of Sukkot, and in order to understand that, it's helpful to understand how things worked by way of rain. So there are only two seasons. There is the rainy season and the dry season. And the rainy season begins in mid-October, and you've got your early rains through November. And then December, January, February are your heavy winter rains. And then March and half of April, you have your latter rains. And then for the next 6 months, you pretty much don't get any rain in the land. Now, that is significant for understanding how places like Arad functioned. So where we have this cistern here, it was strategically placed in the lowest part of the city so that when it rained, they were able to collect all of the water possible, because in an area where there are no springs and rivers and all of that, and you don't get a whole lot of rain, you want to capture every single drop. And whether you're in Arad or it's a cistern somewhere else in the country, at the end of the rainy season, 6 months of rain, your cisterns are filled to the brim. But as you get deeper into the dry season and you're consuming more water, the water level goes down until you get to the very bottom, and you quickly realize that it's actually not clean at the bottom. It's full of sediment and pigeon dung that the water carried into the cistern initially that has settled at the bottom. And it's in these moments where you are at the very end, knowing how desperately you are in need of water. Now, with respect to Sukkot, notice this passage in Leviticus 23. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of the 7th month, and for 7 days, is the Feast of Booths to the Lord." Now, Israel's calendar was based on a lunar cycle, and so things shifted a little bit, but generally speaking, the first month of the year was April, which makes October the 7th month. So when we find out that Sukkot begins on the 15th day of the 7th month and goes for 7 days, you realize that Sukkot is the last week of the dry season. And because of this, they not only celebrated God's provision in the past and in the present, but they pleaded with God to bring rain in the future, i.e., like as soon as possible. And the way that they did this is they centered themselves around this passage in Isaiah 12:3, "With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation." This passage in connection to the passages about God being living water. And the way this was celebrated is that the priest would come down from the temple into the city of David to the pool of Siloam with a golden goblet, dip the goblet into the water, and then carry it back up into the Temple Mount area, go into the temple proper, and pour it onto the altar as a way of saying, "Dear God, bring the living water." On the 7th day, because that would happen on the first 6 days of the festival, but on the 7th and the great day, Hoshana Rabbah, which means the great saving, they would actually do the same procession, but now it wouldn't just be the priest and some people doing it. It was like everybody got involved, and they were shouting and singing songs and blowing trumpets and shaking palm branches, because when you shake a palm branch, it sounds like rain. And this whole procession would go all the way back up to the temple, where the priest would pour it out on to the altar. Now, that's a beautiful illustration from Balaj below, coming here from the Royal Stoa, looking north to give you a feel for all of the people being at a celebration on the Temple Mount area. And in the midst of this celebration, we go a little bit later into John 7, and we read that on the last day of the feast, the great day, Hoshana Rabbah, Jesus stood up and cried out. Now, quick pause. Anytime Jesus speaks, he's usually seated and he's talking. In this case, he's standing up and he's shouting. Why? Because it's probably right at the moment where the priest is pouring out the water in the midst of the cheers of the people. Jesus stands up and screams, "If anyone thirsts, let them come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." And Jesus just identified in the midst of the crowds a biblical image that was reserved for God. And yet Jesus says, "This is me. This is what I offer you." And to the crowds hearing this, many of them were like, "Yes, we want that." And to others, they're like, "How dare him? God said he is living water. Jesus is putting himself on the same level of God. That is treasonous. That man deserves to die." And you start to see tension rises on the heels of the story in the Gospel of John. Now, notice here what happens when you start to look at the connection of living water to God. It shows up in two places. And they're both in Jeremiah. Jeremiah 2:13 we've looked at. Jeremiah 17:13 in the context here is talking about the deceptive nature of the human heart. And we read in Jeremiah 17:13 this, "O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be put to shame. Those who turn away from you shall be written in the dust, for they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living water." There's only two places in the entire Hebrew Scriptures where God is identified as living water. Jeremiah 2:13, Jeremiah 17:13. And Jesus claims to be living water in John 7. What happens in John 8? We have the story of the woman caught in adultery. Now, this is a different story to unpack in a different episode, but this particular story shows up in 6 different places in the ancient manuscripts, and it's in Luke and in John, 6 different places, but it eventually lands in John 8. And when you understand that we're coming off of the festival of Sukkot, Jesus does something very interesting in the midst of this very shady reality, because the religious leaders, what they're doing here is not right. This is not holy. This is not righteous. This is not what God would want. There's a whole lot of problems with what they are doing in dragging this woman without the man before Jesus. And in the midst of this, Jesus bends down and he starts writing in the dust. And people have just said, well, what is he doing? What was he writing? There's all this speculation. Friends, listen, just go back to the other passage about God being living water. O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be put to shame. Those who turn away from you shall be written in the dust. By the fact that Jesus bends down and starts writing in the dust, it says that they started to walk away one by one because they knew exactly what Jesus was declaring to them about what they were doing that was wrong in the eyes of God. Now, that's just a fun connection that pulls together these stories, but one other thing I just want to show and end with is this. That living water is used in connection with God in only 2 places, and they're both in Jeremiah. The same is true with Jesus in the New Testament. It's in 2 places, and it's in the same book. It's in the Gospel of John. And for most of you who are looking at this and seeing John 4, you're going, oh, that is the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. Indeed, Jesus says to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. And like God claiming this image twice, Jesus claims this image twice. And Jesus says, in the midst of your needs, in the midst of the dryness of the deserts and the barren seasons of life where you are trying to figure out up from down and left from right, I am that living water. Come to me and I will provide for you. And not only is this an amazing image of what God is like to us in our difficult seasons. It is also a picture of what followers of Jesus are to be to others who are in the hard seasons of their life. How can we not only experience God as living water in our own lives, but how do we then become a conduit through which God works through us so that living water is able to splash onto the barrenness and desolate seasons of those who desperately need to be met by God's people to experience the goodness of God? So friends, there you go. Our first in the biblical images of God as living water. May you embrace this image. May it deepen your relationship with God. And as always, may you walk out the text well in your life.